how can we be like the Apostle Paul with his beloved Thessalonians when he says that he was like both a nursing mother and an exhorting, imploring father? Uh, the Thessalonians were under tremendous duress and persecution. As a matter of fact, I think there were some that were being killed for their faith. They were being chased by the religious aristocracy of the day, much like today. They can't kill us yet, but someday they'll be the supreme price for our faith. But Paul goes through in this wonderful descriptor of the second chapter and talks about the two ways that he was with them. Let me read it to you. Okay, it's from verse, I think, 12. Well, actually, it's 7 through 12. Okay, and he says, "But we proved to be gentle among you, as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. In the same way, we had a fond affection for you and were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our own lives." And that was in the simple assembly where they were there. They were helping them through that because you had become very dear to us. For you recall, brothers and sisters, brethren, our labor and hardship was by working night and day so as not to be a burden to any of you, that we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly and rightly and blamelessly we behave toward you believers. He didn't say they were sinners, did he? No, he said what? That we were devout and rightly and blamelessly we behave toward you. Not Romans 7 sin. That's Paul's past life. Let's get this right. And then here's the other comparison. Verse 11. Just as you know that we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own children. Why? And here's one of the three places that Paul uses walk worthy. Verse 12. So that you would walk in a manner worthy of God who calls you into his kingdom and glory. In the simple assemblies, I remember when we first started this in 1993, 94, there would be families that would come with younger children. We were older at the time, in our 40s. And there were a fair number of homeschool children, and the mothers would be nursing their new babies. And we'd be in the assembly, and people would be talking or teaching or singing or praying. And there would be a young mother, usually with a shawl or some sort of a blanket over her upper torso, her breasts, and she was nursing one of her newborn babies. Sometimes they were fairly old. They would nurse for like the first couple of years. And I remember the first time it really struck me is that there was sort of this rapture on the face of the mother as she was looking down at her child. And the father might be looking on. It was not unusual to have one or two children that were sort of looking as well. It was a family affair. And, you know, in desperate situations when there's not a lot of food and whatever, it still happens today around the world, that if the baby doesn't get fed the breast milk, the baby dies and perishes. So not only is it wonderful, it's intensely practical. And there's all sorts of things in mother's milk, we know, the colostrum and so forth, that help the baby grow and overcome diseases and so forth and so on. I was not breastfed. Back then, my mother bought into the Dr. Spock stuff, where everybody was fed with a bottle. And many of us missed out on that wonderful opportunity. Who knows how our lives may have been different by that. But he says, Paul, that he, and he says we. So who else was with him? It was the group of his companions at that time. It was earlier in the ministry. As a mother tenderly nurses her own children. She wasn't a wet nurse nursing somebody else, but her own children. Tender, merciful. Isn't that wonderful to have that part of God in a female? Remember, we talked about God has two parts. He's got the warrior, male, protective, providing, imploring, encouraging, and then he has this tenderness and mercifulness too as well. So when we see a husband and wife that are acting in the spirit for the kingdom, we have a complete picture of God. But not to be outdone, after Paul goes through that, he says, you know, we were behaving devoutly and rightly and blamelessly as they behaved. And he said, just as you know, we are exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his children. Those are sort of terms of warfare, of getting up out of the trenches. Let's get on with life. Let's do these things. Exhort, encourage. Remember, we talked a little bit earlier about courage, to get courage, to gather up courage, to do things that are not easy. And implore. I'm imploring you. This is a little bit different than nursing a baby, isn't it? It's tremendously different. Yes, it is. But I know as a man, as a father, I did it to my own children. Many times my children didn't want it. As a matter of fact, Paul says, don't exasperate your children. You know, I'm a proactive person. I'm not floating downstream. I have certain gifting. I have a speaking gift and other gifts. I'm a multi-gifted person like many of you are. And I would be tender and merciful to my children, but I'm also exhorting, encouraging, and imploring them on because the kingdom is taken by storm. Remember, the gates of hell shall not prevail against us. That's the part of Jesus. But then, Jesus wept over Jerusalem. He came up to the widow who had lost her only son, stopped the funeral procession, and said, young man, arise. He raised him from the dead and came back to his mother and said, everybody was in fear and God has visited his people. How about that? That's the ultimate of mercy too as well. So when we tenderly nurse and when we exhort and implore and encourage, why is it? So the punchline is so that, what? Verse 12. We would walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, who calls you into his kingdom in glory. So it's in three places. It's in Thessalonians, it's in Ephesians, and it's in Colossians 1, that we would walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in every respect, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. It's wonderful. Matter of fact, I told you earlier that the modern translations, the dynamic equivalent, where they take the actual underlined manuscripts and the words written in Greek or Hebrew, and then they put a modern phrase with it, phraseology, where the NAS, New American Standard, or the ESV, English Standard Version, or whatever, they try to match every word for word, and I prefer that. I prefer what they call the literal translation rather than the dynamic equivalent, because the NIV, New International Version, dynamic equivalent, says they don't say walk in a manner worthy, they say live a life, because it's written for Western people, and people don't walk together anymore. They ride or they drive, but they don't walk together anymore. I would exhort you and implore you and encourage you, as a father would his children, that you walk with people. But I would also encourage you to be tender and merciful, as a mother who tenderly nurses her children. Amen? Amen. This is Mark White, Executive Director of Walk Worthy Ministries, with another episode of Walking Worthy of the Lord, and that you would walk worthy of the Lord. Remember, we're one day closer to home and to him. Goodbye for now.